Welcome to Functional Philosophy, the show in which I, Charles II, explain and apply Ayn Rand's philosophy, objectivism. If you'd like to ask me a question on objectivism or its application, just go to charles2.com/contact. And my last name is spelled T as in tango, E as in echo, and W as in whiskey. You said that you are not an advocate of equality of opportunity. Do you have a video where you explain this? I certainly do. This one. I am against equality of opportunity for the same reason I am against equality of outcome. These are both attempts to correct metaphysics, to correct existence, and you don't correct facts. Existence is what it is. Things are what they are. And any attempt to correct existence is necessarily destructive. Let me put this in terms of an analogy I found helpful. Imagine a kind of race, not exactly a race, but more a contest of how far you can run. So there's the starting line, and then the goal is to run as far as you can, which represents success in life. The farther you run, the more success you have. Now, people start at different places. Some people start on the starting line. Some people start 10 feet ahead. Some people start 10 feet behind. That is just what nature, what reality gives us to start with. We start at unequal positions. Now, given this basis, what is the proper thing to do? Well, that depends on what you want. Do you want to maximize human potential, or do you want equality? And you cannot have both. These two things are necessarily at odds. Equality means limiting human potential. Egalitarianism is necessarily destructive, whether you're talking about equality of opportunity or outcome. Now, why is this? Well, think about what we could do to achieve equality in this setup. Well, we start out at different positions, so how could we achieve equality of outcome? Well, we could set up a concrete barrier a mile down the road so that no matter what your head start is, no matter how fast you run, you can't go beyond the concrete barrier. Then everybody will just get up to the concrete barrier and stop. And so we have equality of outcome because we've prevented people from going past this distance. You can't go further than a mile. No matter if you could do that, for equality's sake, we're ensuring equal outcome. So nobody can go past this. That's one approach, or you could rig it from the beginning, and you could move people around at the start to ensure that they end up at the same place. But whether they're stopped by some barrier, or you change their starting position, the same thing is going to happen, which is that people's potential will be limited. Let's say you start 10 feet ahead of me. That's just what nature gives us. That's the metaphysical given. You have some social or biological advantage over me, which in terms of this analogy is starting 10 feet ahead. Well, how are we going to make us equal? The gun goes off, we're racing. Now what? How do we become equal? Well, at least you have to wait for me to catch up with you, or you walk backwards to come to my position. One way or another, you with the advantage have to give up your potential so that I can catch up to you. The thing about egalitarianism is that achieving it requires capping the person with the greater potential. All you can do is bring the high low. You can't bring the low high. If you're 10 feet ahead of me, how are we going to be equal? Well, we have to get to the same position somehow, which means you have to wait for me to catch up to you, at best, or you walk backwards to where I am. In either case, you're wasting your time, and instead of running forward and making progress, you are squandering your potential so that I catch up with you. There is no way to equalize us without capping your potential. Here's another way you can think about it. We all have some theoretical maximum potential. Let's say each one of us makes all the right decisions in life. Now, this is not to say there aren't optional decisions, but there are also good decisions and bad decisions. We all have a theoretical maximum potential, which is the result we'll get if we make all of the best decisions in life. or all good decisions, let's say. Because there are options. I'm not saying that there's always one better than every other decision. Sometimes there are options, but there are also often good decisions and bad decisions. So let's say you choose at least one of the good decisions every time a choice of that kind comes up. Well, then you'll live the best life possible to you. However, you don't get to choose your context. And so let's say you are in a position such that if you make all the right decisions for you, you'll end up with 100, let's say. I'm just being arbitrary here. I'm just quantifying it to make it simple. You'll have 100 level success. And if I make all the right decisions, I'll have 80. Well, how are we going to equalize us? Well, if my maximum potential is 80, there's no way I can go beyond my maximum. That's my maximum. So the only way for us to be equal is to cut down your potential and make sure that you don't go past 80, even though you could have. So you can't go beyond reality. You are given a context at the start, and you can make the most of it or do some amount less than that. But you can't go beyond what's possible to you. And if the maximum possible to you is more than what is possible to me, then the only way we can guarantee equality is to prevent you from doing your best. It's not to allow me to do more than my best, because that's impossible. So if we're going to have equality, we are going to be capping human potential. And that is why I'm against equality of opportunity, because it's just a form of that. Instead of redistributing wealth once people have created it, it's rigging it from the start. It's let's redistribute wealth such that everybody goes to the same kind of schools, etc. Let's correct for natural inequality. No, because all you can do is cut down on people's potential. You can't raise up the low. All you can do is limit the high. So the only rational policy is to leave everyone free to run as far as he can, given what he starts with. And if that were what people meant by equality of opportunity, I would be for it. In that sense, equality of opportunity just means the equal opportunity to make the most of what nature gives you, not the right to have people correct inequalities of nature, which is what people actually mean when they talk about equality of opportunity. So I am against any attempt to correct facts. Next question. Do you think that Black Americans have a claim to the land their ancestors worked on prior to emancipation? No. Now let's leave aside that this would be used as an excuse for socialism and racist nihilism, even if we didn't have to worry about that, just considering the question objectively. No, you couldn't do this. Well, why not? Well, let's consider the ends of the spectrum here. Are we going to correct for misdeeds that took place 100,000 years ago? No, obviously not. There's obviously a statute of limitations on this kind of thing. We can't attempt to correct all rights violations throughout all of human history. That's simply impossible. On the other hand, if somebody snatches your wallet away from you, should you get it back, or should you say, well, that action was in the past? Obviously, you should get it back. If the police catch this guy, then you should get your wallet back. So what is the principle dividing when it is proper to correct rights violations versus when you have to let them go? Now, you might think this is a generational dividing line. So if somebody steals from you, you can get that money back. Whereas if somebody steals from you and gives it to his kid who had nothing to do with it, then you can't get it back because now it's involved with somebody else, this person's kid, and it's just too muddy at that point. Or maybe you'd come up with some standards such as 2 generations, 3 generations. But I think this can happen even in a single generation. You think of any Ponzi schemer. Think of Bernie Madoff. Now, when they catch him, after he's taken from Peter to pay Paul, and he's defrauded people out of money and given it to other people and mixed everything all up, now you catch him. And you say, hey, you took my money and paid this guy. Well, then what? Madoff doesn't have the money anymore. Do you go to this other guy? But now he's invested the money or given it to somebody else. That would just be impossible to untangle. So I would say that property rights violations cannot be corrected once the property has been given to innocent people in some way. Now, if you could get the money from the rights violator, that of course is one thing. He would owe you what he stole from you. But once it gets tangled up in other innocent people who didn't realize what was going on, well then what, are you going to take the money from them to give it back to the other person? I mean, that's the question of reparations for African slaves. Now what, we're just going to take money from white people and redistribute it to black people? Even though no one today had anything to do with that. Maybe you could make the case that if somebody steals a big bag of money you had in your house and then he gives it to some other person free and clear, well then if the cops catch him and he tells him where he put the money and that guy still has this big bag of money, then it would go back to you. But if that person invests the money or he loses it or that money gets, made use of in some way that's impossible to untangle, well then you can't do anything about it. So I think that's what the principle would be. Once the money gets tangled up with innocent people, then there's just no way of untangling it, and any attempt to do so would only be more destructive. And the question of slave reparations, that obviously falls on the side of way too tangled to correct now. It also just wouldn't do any good. In fact, it would do a lot of harm. Just look at what welfare does to blacks. Look at what the money the government gives to American Indians does to them. They are in a horrible position, in large part because the government gives them free money on racist grounds. So this wouldn't even be a practical solution. This would just make things worse, and it would make things worse because it would be a rights violation. The moral and the practical go together here as they do everywhere else. Black people have no claim to reparations, and so getting them would put them in an even worse position than they are now. It's obviously not lack of government money that is holding black people back in the U.S. That is just a laughable claim at this point. Next question. Have seen your video on Jordan Peterson not understanding physics, in which you talk about how Einstein and current-day physicists wrongly interpret data. If possible, could you elaborate on that some more? And then he gives a whole list of specific questions. It's not possible, I'm afraid. I'm not a scientist, so I don't know the data, so I can't answer these detailed questions. I am a philosopher, so I can go into the metaphysics, but the thing is, metaphysics is a highly delimited subject. It is a very broad, very thin foundation. I say thin not to imply instability, but to imply the very limited content of the subject, at least very limited content from a rational approach. Obviously, people have attempted to deduce all kinds of things from metaphysics, but that's wrong. Rationally speaking, you can't get very far with metaphysics. It provides you a few basic rules, really just one basic rule, and a few corollaries, and that's it. And the details are the realm of science, which is not my realm. Metaphysics just tells you existence exists, everything that exists is what it is, and that's about it. So if you want to tell me that a particle can be in two places at once, or can move between position A and B without traversing the distance in between, then I can rule that out on metaphysical grounds. But if you want details about how the physical world works, I can't give you those. You can't get those from philosophy. You have to do the science. If Lawrence Krauss says, as he does, that philosophy is secondary, philosophy doesn't really matter, logic is derivative, in a sense it is. Logic is an empirical question. But Lawrence Krauss says that this means that if we see that a particle can be in two places at once, if we see that physics overturns logic as we know it, we'll just redefine logic. Maybe contradictions can exist. We'll just have to redo logic if the physics shows that logic is wrong. Now that I can veto with an iron fist, but I can't tell you all of the details of quantum physics or any of these other things you're asking about. Now the good news is that you have an interest in something. I get questions like this all the time, and I understand why. We live in the physical world, and We want to know the nature of that world, and that is the whole subject matter of physics. But physics is not philosophy. So all these people who ask me these questions, you have an area to investigate. Maybe this is your passion. That's great. But you just have to understand that it's not philosophy. It's physics. Now, I suspect what's going on in a lot of these cases is that people are sincerely fascinated by physics, but they're intimidated by the math and science involved, and so they want to get as much as they can wring out of philosophy without having to do any of that intimidating stuff. But there's very little you can get out of pure philosophy in this regard, and so you do have to do that intimidating stuff. Now, I don't think math has to be this horrible thing. I think math is fun. I think you can learn to enjoy it, even if you were trained to hate it, because public schools are really just centers for teaching people to hate learning and thinking. But I think if you invest in it, if you put forth the effort, you can get around that. And in any case, you're going to have to, if you're interested in physics, because I can't tell you much more than I've already said. I mean, you can come up with false theories all day long and have me veto them, but that's all I can do. I can't tell you what is true. I can only tell you what's outside the range of possibly being true, what is out of bounds. That's what philosophy has to offer here. You know, philosophy has so little to say on this subject that I think even what I have said has overstepped the boundaries. I have said things that I'm not quite sure are correct anymore. I'm not going to go into them now, but I will at some point. I'd like to point out when I'm wrong like this, by the way, because it's easy to get this idea that if you were just honest enough, you would never make a mistake. When you hear somebody who is usually correct and correct about things in a revolutionary way, for instance, with Ayn Rand, she is so revolutionarily correct about such advanced issues and so rarely wrong, at least so rarely wrong in the material that's put out there. It's not like today. We don't have 500 hours of Ayn Rand doing casual live streams. So I do think it's valuable to notice the mistakes of people like Ayn Rand, because it helps break you out of this mentality. Peikoff once said that some people have the mentality that the answers are in the back of the book given by Ayn Rand. You know, like in a math book, the answer will be in the back. And a lot of people think, and they will think about something, but then at the end of the day, they'll just refer to whatever Ayn Rand said. But Ayn Rand had to figure things out just like we do. And she wasn't right because she was Ayn Rand. She was right because she was right. And she had to think about things. I emphasize morality a lot, but that doesn't mean I think everyone who's wrong or confused about anything is dishonest. Somebody commented in response to one of these recent videos where I was talking about my intellectual method and honesty, when I said that what differentiated Ayn Rand from other people is that she was honest. This person said, well, so that means that any philosopher in history was just dishonest because they didn't achieve what Ayn Rand did? No. You know, there is such a thing as time. There's only so much you can accomplish in one lifetime. There's such a thing as time and context. It's not as if you decide to be honest and then in one instant, in a flash, you are filled with omniscience because you've chosen to be honest. Honesty means applying a method scrupulously over time. So it's not as if I think that people who are honest will understand everything I understand. You have to work up to that, and people exist in different contexts, and maybe some people have material that allows them to reach certain conclusions faster than other people. That's fine. So this is important so that you don't feel any unearned guilt. It's easy to suffer that, and I have suffered that in the past. But I made this mistake of thinking that the self-evident means the omnipresent. But that's false. The self-evident is not the omnipresent. The self-evident does not mean philosophically axiomatic. You know, in any instance of awareness, the implicit fact of existence and identity are present. But those are only a couple special cases. A vast majority of self-evident things are not omnipresent. It's self-evident that the table in front of me exists, but I still have to come look at it. Everything perceptual is self-evident, but that doesn't mean it's omnipresent. You're not always in this room capable of looking at this table. So I used to think regarding basic philosophical ideas, if I were just honest, I wouldn't have any trouble here, because this is all self-evident. It's all right here. Why can't I get it? If I don't understand the self-evident, that must be the result of evasion. But that's not true. Think about a forest, and every tree represents a different idea. Well, if the idea is self-evident, that's one thing, but that doesn't mean you're always looking at that tree all the time. Even if you are up in the sky and you have this bird's eye view and you can see all trees at once, you still have to focus on each individual tree in order to get it. That is why it's not necessarily dishonest to not understand free will, for instance. Now that's self-evident, but that doesn't mean it requires evasion to not understand it. Even though implicitly it's always there, you still have to focus on it. So somebody can even explain it to you and you won't get it. But that's because you have to choose to look at it. The same as with this forest analogy. Somebody can tell you about some particular tree in the forest, but it's possible that you won't really understand it until you go look at it. In fact, that's definitely the case. You have to go look at that individual tree yourself. And even though it's always there implicitly, you're not necessarily being dishonest because you haven't chosen to see it yet. So anyway, it's important not to think of the self-evident as the omnipresent. At least not the omnipresent in focal awareness. Implicit knowledge is omnipresent, but you're not always focused on it. People ask about the law of identity. Well, if it's self-evident, how come people don't get it? How come not everybody understands this? Well, because it's implicit. It's always there, but you still have to focus on it. The same way something can be in your peripheral vision, but you still have to focus on it in order to see it clearly. The fact that it's always there doesn't mean it's always focused on by you. And somebody can tell you about it, but you're not really sure what they're talking about. So don't feel unearned guilt. Don't feel like if you don't understand something basic and philosophical that you must have been dishonest or evading, because that's not true. So even though metaphysics is about what is not only self-evident, but what is also always implicitly there, you have all the material you need to be able to come to all valid metaphysical conclusions at all times. Even though that's true, it's still possible to make mistakes. Honestly, I have. Howdy, howdy, it's me, a week in the future, and as I'm editing this and preparing to put it up, it occurs to me that I should tell you precisely what I've changed my mind about so that you don't start to doubt everything I've ever said about metaphysics. I am specifically referring to the idea that all physical entities bump up against each other. I said philosophy couldn't rule out entities that lack extension but exist in spatial terms, which doesn't make any sense. And it was a contradiction I engaged in as a result of trying to reconcile an apparent contradiction in Ayn Rand, which is not actually a contradiction, just something I didn't understand, but with a few more days' thought, I figured it out. I currently plan to have the whole subject of entities be the first chapter in my book on objectivism, so I will elaborate there, but I just want to make clear here that what I was wrong about was that entities necessarily exist in spatial terms. That is not true. I wouldn't want you to go off thinking space is a thing or that nothing exists, after all. Anyway, Merry Christmas, and see you next week. If you'd like to keep up with everything I do, just go to charles2.com. If you'd like to enable me to do more, just go to patreon.com/charles2 and become a supporter. Thanks for listening.